Sunshine TV, class in session. This is what I do. Peace to the planet. Learning about the Anunnakis, our ancestors. And we be on the same level of consciousness.
Anunnaki Council of 12 in early dynastic city-states.
Council of 12.
It was formerly believed that in the early dynastic period, all the city's land belonged to the temple and was administered by the Ensi, city ruler, governor, as the bailiff of the city deity. More recent research gives an extraordinary picture. It is likely that in the original village settlements, all land was community land from which all families received an allotment according to their needs. Part of the land would also be set aside to maintain the shrine of the community's deity and the priests who served there. Nevertheless, in primitive societies, religious functionaries can exercise powerful sanctions by their ability to manipulate divine decisions, and this would favor the temple priesthood gaining disproportionately large allotments of land. Moreover, primitive people feel that once something has had a god, it has become sacral and must henceforth be set apart from everyday use. Consequently, land once allotted to the deity would come to be thought of as distinct from the shared pool of community land, and thus separated off as the permanent property of the temple. There were also factors leading to other parts of the communal land coming into the permanent ownership of particular families. When plots were first allotted from the communal land, the more powerful families would ensure that they received the most favorable allocations, and once having taken all the best land, they would be loath to let it go back into the general pool for a redistribution, which could only be to their disadvantage. Eventually, it would be in the interests of all the most influential families to adopt as a legal principle that land was the hereditary property of the family currently holding it. Families could, and sometimes did, sell their land. In such an event, a senior member or group of members would act for the whole. A third landowner was the state, as the Ensi and his family. In the Sumerian view of things, the Ensi ruled because he was the human representative of the city god, and that status gave him the opportunity of taking over, not always without opposition, some of the temple lands to support his functions. Thus, in some circumstances, some of what had been temple land became state land. For the middle of the third millennium, we know less about lands in state or private tenure than about temple lands. Temple lands were of three categories. The first, known as the Lord's Field, was used to supply the needs of the temple itself, including the cult. The second category was land allotted to laborers, administrators, and artisans of the temple estate in return for their service to God. The rest of the temple land was let out on a sharecropping basis, for which rent equivalent to 1/3 of the crop was paid, partly in silver and partly in kind. As Lagash grew wealthy by trade and the ruler's power increased because of the stable dynasty, it underwent economic and social changes which some populations viewed as abuses. The major complaints were two. First, the Ensi was treating the temple lands and God's possessions as his property. Second, citizens were subject to excessive taxes. Taxes were, for example, levied on cattle, fishery.
With the Chase mobile app, I can pay my bills, redeem rewards for cash back, plus access deals where I shop. Bargains, baby! Oh, wow. Man, this thing does everything.
There it goes.
Fisheries, sheep shearing, betrothal, divorce, and burial.
Unbelievable.
The economic developments also produced a class of wealthy men who used their wealth to oppress the poor. A rich man might make a poor man a loan and then foreclose at an inconvenient time. When the poor man proved unable to repay, the creditor would seize in settlement an animal or other goods of value far exceeding the amount owing.
Wow. Same thing.
Economic reforms. These economic problems, combined with a power struggle between the temple authorities and the city-state administration, ended the Ur-Nanshi dynasty. 13 years after that dynasty, there came to power Ur-Inimgina, who attempted to eradicate the abuses which had arisen. We have several inscriptions of his in which he records the abuses and lists his reforms designed to protect the poor from victimization. The houses and the fields of the Ensi, the houses and the fields of the Ensi's womenfolk were joined side by side. These were the practices of former times. When the god Ningirsu gave the kingship of Lagash to Uru-Inimgina, he set up for him the divine decrees of former times. He made the goddess Bau queen of the houses and the fields of the Ensi's womenfolk. However, Lagash was too far gone in decline. These reforms were not sufficient or soon enough to restore economic strength and stability, and Uru-Inimgina fell victim to the perennial rivalry between Lagash and Umma. The latter was now closely tied to the powerful city-state of Erech, with whose support the king of Umma, Lugal-Zagezi, finally overthrew Uru-Inimgina shortly after 2400 BC at the beginnings of imperialism. Lugal-Zagezi was an early imperialist. He embarked upon a policy of military conquest which ultimately brought all Sumer, not at first Akkad, under his control, with Erech as his capital. He also claimed to wield influence well outside Sumer, from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, along the Tigris and Euphrates to the upper sea, the Mediterranean, so that all rulers of Sumer and of independent countries bowed to his arbitration in Erech. How far this claim accords with the truth is questionable. Probably it is an idealized picture, not necessarily entirely according to political realities. It shows that in the 24th century BC, an ideal was current of internal peace under a suzerain powerful enough to check all rivalry, and external peace through a ruler of such influence that he was accepted as an international arbitrator. Lugal-Zagezi's political expansion was not an entirely recent phenomenon. Since the time of Akka of Kish, there had been fleeting attempts at hegemony over vast areas. For example, during the reign of Ur-Nanshi's second successor, Eannatum, the forces of Mari on the middle Euphrates had penetrated almost to Lagash, 400 miles to the southeast. Lugal-Zagezi aimed more permanent domination of Mesopotamia, which he seemed to achieve when he successfully attacked Kish, still the leading city in northern Babylonia. The Sumerian king list tells us Kish was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was taken away to Erech. In Erech, Lugal-Zagezi became king and reigned for 25 years. Lugal-Zagezi was overthrown. Erech was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was taken away to Agade. In Agade, Sharum-Kin, whose father was a gardener, cupbearer of Ur-Zababa, an earlier king of Kish, became king and reigned for 56 years. Sargon of Agade. Sharum-Kin, meaning the king is true, better known as Sargon, is Semitic.
That's my God.
The latter word should probably be used, as here, as a technical term for a language of a particular group. Where use is made in this book of such phrases as Semitic peoples, Semites or the like, It is to be understood that this is a convenient shortening for peoples who spoke Semitic languages, implying no ethnic presuppositions or theories about race.
All the ancestors.
An Arabic proverb says, "The desert is the cradle of the Arab, and Iraq his grave." This recognizes that successive waves of Semitic-speaking peoples have moved from the west into Mesopotamia, assimilating into the existing population throughout history. We had already seen that Semitic speakers were one element in ancient Mesopotamian civilization from its very beginnings, before 3000 BC, and that by 2900 BC the Semitic element was so prominent, at least in the north of what was to become Babylonia, that the Sumerian king list gives Semitic names for most of the rulers of the first dynasty of Kish. By 2600 to 2500 BC, tablets from Abu Salabih near Nippur in central Sumer bear many Semitic names, including about half the scribes who wrote those tablets, in Sumerian. There is no evidence from the century before Sargon, reigned 2371 to 2316 BC, for anything in a Semitic invasion, and such Semites as arrived during that time probably came in as individual families, settling in the Sumerian cities and rapidly adopting Sumerian culture and loyalty to their adoptive city-state. We know directly of Sargon's antecedents from what we are told on the Sumerian king list already quoted. This is supplemented by traditions in legends, of which the most important is preserved only in cuneiform copies of the first millennium BC, although in literary origin it probably goes back to the early second millennium.
Let's go.
The legend is presented as though told by Sargon himself, and has been called a pseudo-biography. It reads, "I am Sargon, the mighty king, the king of Agade. My mother was a high priestess. I do not know my father. My paternal kin inhabits the mountains. My town was Azupiranu, which lies on the bank of the Euphrates. My mother conceived me and bore me in secret. She put me in a reed basket. She made it watertight with pitch. She left me to the river, from which I could not get away. The river took me along. It brought me to Aki, a water drawer. Aki, the water drawer, drew me up when he dipped his bucket in. Aki, the water drawer, brought me up as his son. Aki, the water drawer, put me to his garden work. Ishtar came to love me through my garden work, so I exercised the kingship for 55 years. This composition must have had some purpose. It may have been written to entertain a story about an already famous hero, edify population groups who saw Sargon as their ancestor, or boost a ruler who wished to present himself as in the mold of the great Sargon. Whatever the purpose was, it would not have been achieved unless it is a framework for Sargon conformed to existing traditions about him. The essential framework of the legend tells us this about Sargon. His father was unknown. This need not imply illegitimacy, but only, since in Semitic society the descent is defined by the male line, and the longer, the more honorable, that his forebears were nobodies. The legend is saying obliquely that Sargon's birth was not insignificant. His mother may have passed on to him royal blood, perhaps even, from her relationship to the god, an element of divinity. The legend then brushes aside the insignificance of Sargon's paternal descent by a theme that combines religious belief and folklore. His mother, it tells us, was an Entu, a high priestess. Now, an Entu was from the cultic point of view the wife of the god, and in human terms invariably of noble birth, and often a royal princess. A legend glorifying a historical figure cannot disregard known facts, but it can reinterpret them most favorably to the hero. Having explained that Sargon's birth was far more exalted than formerly supposed, it now turns to Aki, the water drawer. The name means, "I poured out," and it looks like a name invented as suitable for a water drawer. Since the legend found it necessary to introduce such a foster father to explain how Sargon began as an irrigator and gardener, we accept that historically Sargon was an irrigator and gardener. The Sumerian king list confirms this by saying, his father, word damaged and restored, was a gardener. King list says that he was the cupbearer of a former king of Kish. Was he? In Akkadian, the word for cupbearer is saku, and a word with precisely the exact spelling means irrigation worker. The same word in Sumerian does not denote these two officials.
Catch your train without your wallet. Pay your fare with just your phone. It's the contact.
Right now.
It looks as though the compiler of the Sumerian king list, written in Sumerian, mistook an Akkadian tradition which said that Sargon was an irrigation official of Ur-Zababa, and wrongly rendered it to say that he was his cupbearer. Everything then ties up. Sargon was of insignificant descent. His people came from the middle Euphrates. He was brought up as an irrigator, and because he did this successfully, which is what being loved by his goddess implies, when his family moved southeast into the territory of Kish, he entered the royal service, becoming the senior administrator in charge of the irrigation system so vital to Babylonia. This would have involved him in organizing large bodies of men. After the downfall of the last king of Kish, he used the administrative organization he had built up to develop his authority, and, by installing himself at Agade, a deserted site on a branch of the Euphrates, he created a power base without running up against vested interests within existing northern cities. With his tribal links, he could reinforce his new city with his relatives. Agade is the usual but possibly inaccurate rendering of the name of the city which Sargon founded as his capital. The Semitic spelling is Akkad, which may have meant the ancestral town, and this term became used not only for the city but also for North Babylonia as a whole. The city is still unidentified, although it was probably near to its ultimate successor, Babylon. The Sumerian king list gives no hint of thinking that Sargon's succession supplanted a Sumerian dynasty to a different ethnic stock. Indeed, Sargon himself accepted the Sumerian cultural heritage. His first action after defeating Lugal-Zagezi was to display him as his prisoner before the great Sumerian god Enlil in his city Nippur, in recognition of the theological principle that only Enlil at Nippur could legitimate a king, and he explicitly claimed that it was Enlil who had given him victory. He named Sumerian deities in his titles, and his daughter not only bore a Sumerian name, Enheduanna, but was a high priestess, En, of the great moon god Nana, in the major Sumerian-speaking city of Ur. Though it endured for little more than a century, the dynasty Sargon founded left a permanent imprint on Mesopotamian society. Sargon tells us he won 34 battles, taking cities stretching from Ur in South Sumer to Ebla in North Syria. The latter, now Tel Mardikh, has been excavated since 1974, and the results show how far Sumerian culture had spread from its home region of southern Mesopotamia. The finds included over 10,000 inscribed clay tablets of about the time of Sargon, obviously heavily dependent upon the Sumerian writing system and Sumerian literary forms, although using a West Semitic language distinct from the Semitic language Akkadian spoken in southern Mesopotamia. Sargon exercised a deliberate